I bow to the gurus of this divine lineage of Kriya Yoga, Mahavatar Babaji, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Yukteswar Giri, and my own Guru Paramhansa Yogananda. And I bow to my divine friend and guide, Swami Kriyananda. Namaste friends. Welcome to another episode of the series The Path of Kriya Yoga. I want to start by apologizing because I have not been able to keep up the promised cadence of one class every week in the series. I was hoping when I started that I would be able to share with you one class every Friday morning, but because some of these classes and topics require some study on my part and also the time to film and process and post them on time, somehow other preoccupations have kept me from being able to do that regularly. From this week on, I hope to be a little more regular. Even if I cannot do it every Friday, I promise that I'll have something to share with you at least every other Friday, because there are a lot of interesting topics that are related to Kriya Yoga, meditation, and this particular lineage of how we work with subtle energies, how do we work with ourselves in the practice of meditation. So I do have other things to say. Hopefully I'll be able to keep up the cadence, and like always, I love hearing from all of you. Some of you had reached out to me asking when I was going to release my next video, so here it is. But if you have any suggestions for topics, things that you would like for me to cover or discuss in this particular series, feel free to write to me. I love to hear your comments and feedback on these videos. The topic that I'm going to be discussing with you today, as you can see from the title of this video, is death and conscious dying. It's a very interesting and perhaps a heavy topic. It is one of those topics that most people are curious about on the spiritual path, especially if you're a student of metaphysics, if you're a practitioner of meditation. Death and conscious dying are really, really important and relevant topic for people to meditate on. And not only that, it also tends to sometimes be a very personally meaningful and impactful topic for a lot of people, especially those who might have had those near and dear to them leave their body or struggle through their own process of dealing with departed loved ones. Or as all of us, one day we will also be facing that same exam. So it is not just for those who have had people in their family die, but for all of us, because this is the final exam, as we call it, on the spiritual path. And it is what life is. Life is, after all, preparation for that final exam, preparation for that moment of death. So in this video, I'm going to discuss with you some ideas related to meditation, the process of dying, some teachings of Yogananda ji on how we die and how we can lift ourselves at that moment of death, which is the reason why we are practicing meditation, why we are practicing a sacred science such as Kriya Yoga. So hopefully you'll find this video useful. I want to start by some of my own personal recollections. I'm not that old, so I cannot claim to have witnessed or seen a lot of people die in this life. But like all of us, I've also seen one or two people near and dear to me, people that are close to me that have left the body. And that has in fact taught me a few lessons that I want to start with. There are a few different experiences that come to my mind when I think of death and my own experience or encounter with it. Not personally like I'm dying, but through the death of somebody else. But the one that comes to me most strongly is the death of somebody who was very close to me. This was a cousin, a brother of mine back in India, and he died a very unexpected and untimely death. I was probably 23, 24 years old. It was about 10 years ago, I think. I'm not 100% certain. And this brother of mine, this cousin brother of mine, was not very old. He was a very young and very, very strong man. So it came as a very unexpected surprise. He died of natural causes. He also had a wife and a child. So it was a deeply sad moment, both for myself and for everyone in our family. Now, what I remember most vividly was this. I was in Chennai, which is the town I grew up in, where I'm from, when this event happened, and my brother had passed away in a different town in India. The body was brought to his home in Chennai. And as it was brought, I was one of those people, I was very young and physically capable. And I don't remember the exact sequence of what happened, but I was one of those people carrying his physical dead body from one room to the other. I was bringing it outside of the house to lay it on something that was prepared for the body to rest in for a few minutes or a few hours before it was going to be cremated. And what I remember most vividly during that experience is that as I was lifting, I was holding on to his shoulder. And this brother of mine was a very, very heavy man. He was probably 6 feet 4 inches or 5 inches. He was very tall. And he was also a very heavily built guy. He was a very strong person. And also, I had just met him, I would say, a few weeks before he left his body. So it was so vivid for me. As I was lifting and carrying that body of his, this idea was so strongly coming to me that this is not him. This is a body. This is a physical body. The fact that there is no life in that body was so vivid. It was something that I just couldn't skip. It was not something that I could fail noticing. And again, I was surprised at that fact somehow. I don't remember why. Because perhaps when I was lifting or when I would be lifting somebody alive, the feeling would be different. And I have not done this before, so I don't quite know how the body of a person who has just passed out responds differently from a dead body. So I don't quite know what the exact detail was that made me constantly think about it. But I do remember that it was coming to me very strongly. And when the body was laid down, and all the other members of the family, especially those that were close to him, they sort of started mourning. They were deeply saddened by this incredible loss. And everybody was gathering around this physical body of his, and they were deeply mourning, deeply saddened at this demise. And the thought kept coming to me over and over again. Yes, he has left. It is very unfortunate. It is very sad. But that is not him. That physical body lying there is not the person I knew, is not the person that I met a few weeks ago. And it seems so self-evident. It seems like the most trivial of facts. However, when it comes to you as a realization, it was somehow profound for me. It was somehow a realization that shook my reality in a way, because I was just wondering, why is everybody treating this body this way? This is a body that is going to be cremated or buried in a few hours. It might as well go to trash. It doesn't matter. It is simply a bag of bones now. It is not that person. Perhaps the reason I was feeling it so strongly is that most of the time as we move through life, we mistake the body to be the person. And at this moment, as I was looking at this body, this image was so clear to me, this realization that that is not the person who died. The person who died has left that body. What is left here is a piece of garbage. It is not worth anything. Now, I shared that personal experience because death often tends to be something deeply personal to us when we face it, for many, many reasons, but the most important one being that we all ourselves have died many, many times. In fact, as Yogananda ji says, millions of times. It's almost scary to think about. So we all have memories of death. And in fact, in Yogananda ji, in one of his writings, he talks about how the fear of death itself comes from that memory of us having lived through this experience over and over again, because it's involuntary. For most people, in most cases, death is not a voluntary choice. Even if you're 90 years old and your body is completely giving up, still the prana is pulled out of the body. You're being forced out of your house like an eviction. That's how we experience death. So it is a very vivid and a rather painful experience in most cases. That's why there is this lingering fear of death that all of us, I would say most of us, hold in our own subconscious. I will share another personal anecdote from my own life. A very, very critical moment in my spiritual life, I would say a turning point in my own spiritual quest in this incarnation, came toward the end of high school. I know that's a rather young age. And it came through a documentary that I saw somewhere. It was a DVD that I had, or somebody gave it to me. This was a documentary titled The Tibetan Book of the Dead. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. Maybe you've read about it or read the book itself. I'm sure this documentary is also out there somewhere if you want to find and watch it. And this documentary talks about this ancient Tibetan scripture and all their death rituals. How, when a person is dying, he is guided through this process of how to gracefully leave the body, how to lift himself through this opportunity to liberate his soul, or if not, at least find the right next step for him. And there is this process of how you speak to that dying soul. Of course, it is all in their culture, in their language, but it is beautifully expressed and reflect the principles of Sanatan Dharma, which is the absolute truth. It's not just how Tibetans die, it's how Hindus, Christians, Muslims, all of us leave this body. Now, the personally touching part for me in this whole documentary was this line. I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, I don't quite remember. The documentary talks about how life itself is a flow. I think it's called Bardo or something like that. And as life flows, death and rebirth and all these are just punctuations in that eternal flow of life. It's not like life begins with birth or ends with death. Life began well before this birth, and it will continue even after death. And the narrator who's narrating this documentary, he talks about how every time a child incarnates, every time somebody comes onto this plane, it is because the last time they went through this flow, went through this doorway of death, they were not able to fully relinquish everything that they mistakenly identified as their own, because of which they've needed to take on another human body and to work out the karma and to further their own growth. So they are in this human body because they were not able to successfully complete their assignment last time. And every time somebody dies, it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity for them to finish all unfinished business, to surrender completely into the light, to relinquish all personal attachments, everything that we mistakenly see as ourselves, and completely liberate our soul. And this is where it becomes ironical. And yet, we celebrate birth as something auspicious, something great, something beautiful and joyful. However, we mourn death. Where is joy? Where is mourning here? We have taken an incarnation because it is a great opportunity. I don't mean to sound like a pessimist or somebody who is always negative, but in a sense, birth is a beautiful occasion, but also it is a beginning for an incarnation where a lot of things have to be set right. We have to find our course into a spiritual path, into rediscovering our own doorways to salvation, and walk through life and learn our lessons in order to finish and pass that final exam successfully. And every time we take that exam, we go through that doorway of death, it is an opportunity for us to completely liberate from this cycle of suffering. So what is there to mourn or celebrate in either of these? Now, this whole philosophical idea got me thinking very deeply, and from then on, I started reading more and more about death and life and meditation and all of that, which finally led me to the autobiography of a yogi. Now, that's just my own personal story, but I don't think it's unique, because for a lot of people, this contemplation on death, this idea of losing somebody or losing your own life, is what triggers a spiritual impulse. It sets us on a journey. While I'm sharing about this, maybe a lot of you know the story of this great saint and realized soul Ramana Maharishi, who Master himself met during his trip to India. In Ramana Maharishi's life, I think he was 7 or 8 years old when his dad died, and this experience of his dad's passing was so traumatic, so personally shattering for his universe, that he immediately started thinking, what is death? What is dying? What just happened here? Who am I? Am I the person that's going to die? And this thread of contemplation led him to deeply meditate, that he attained a very high state. I mean, he was born into that realization. He had it even before that life. But that event was the turning point in his journey as well, that led him to realizing what his work in this life was, and to fully express himself spiritually as the spiritual giant that he was. Now, I want to go to some of the more practical details of what death is and share Yoganandaji's teachings on it. Master, or Yoganandaji, I'm referring to Paramahansa Yogananda whenever I use the word master, he talks about death quite a bit, and he gives us a lot of details of how we as human beings go through this process of death. What happens when we leave the physical body? Now, I'm sure you've heard the concept of chakras and subtle energy and prana and the subtle nadis and all of that. Maybe you watched the other episodes in the same series where I talk about some of these topics. What happens in death, in essence, is that prana is pulled back into the spine and then it ascends upward and it exits through this point of the medulla. I'm going to discuss that in greater detail in just a bit. But what's in essence happening is that we are dissociating from the physical body. When I say we, the prana, the energy self that we identify with, is dissociating, it's disconnecting from that physical vehicle, that physical container that has been used for expressing that in this world. Now I'm going to read some from Master's original writings, Paramhansa Yoganandaji's writings on death, which, as I was researching this subject, I found rather fascinating and interesting. I'm first going to read a little bit on how Master describes the transition out of that physical body, what happens when we die. And here's how he describes the death as the physical body experiences it. The first step is the gradual numbness of the limbs, muscles, heart, lungs, and diaphragm. During the spreading of numbness in the limbs and muscles, a sense of sadness, helplessness, and a desire to live come into mind. Now, this is an avatar explaining to us what will happen, what all of us are about to face. When the numbness reaches the heart muscle, a sense of pain and suffocation is experienced, which causes an extreme fear of death. An attachment toward possessions and loved ones strongly comes upon the soul and causes extreme mental grief. It is so interesting that Yoganandaji goes into this extreme level of detail, because what's happening is, as I was describing, the prana is pulled away from the extremities. Now, if you have seen somebody actually leave their body, you would know that first their limbs stop responding to their mental commands, which is their hands and legs do not actually do what they want to do. They're already separating. There is no life force flowing in them. And gradually, all life concentrates in the spine. They come back into the spine. And even in the spine, it starts leaving one by one each spinal center, starting with the root, starting from bottom up, the root, sacral, lumbar. And as Yoganandaji is explaining here, when that prana is leaving the heart center, when the heart is realizing that this body vehicle is no longer going to be available for me to express in the same way I've been expressing for all these years, then there's this extreme fear of death that grips us. This is the center of likes and dislikes, and as Master beautifully puts it, an attachment towards possessions and loved ones comes strongly upon the soul and causes extreme mental grief. It is so difficult to even contemplate on that moment when that prana is going to pass. Now, as you're watching this, as we go through experiences in our life, it might be rather easy for us to say, I'll be fine. I don't think I'm that attached to my spouse or my wealth or my body or my physical abilities or whatever it is. But I think that moment of death really teaches us a lot of lessons about ourselves. I was recently, not too long ago, just a few months ago, somebody else very close to me in my family left their body. And as they were nearing their transition, I was on phone with them quite a few times, and they were describing how painful this experience was. And also I was noticing that this person did not necessarily display many of these attachments when their physical body was able and alive. But as they were nearing that moment of death, they were displaying so many attachments which they did not know existed inside them, which none of us knew existed inside that person. And this person had a long struggle, for many, many weeks or months. She went through a difficult process of leaving that body, of almost hospice type of condition, where it was clear that she was going to leave, but then it was not going to happen immediately. And as she was living through those days and weeks of knowing that death was just waiting and she was going to leave her body soon, these attachments, this mental grief that Master is describing, I could see that playing out. And this is an extremely spiritual person, and yet she had to go through that experience because these attachments exist inside all of us. With the pain of suffocation, there is a great mental struggle to bring the breath back again. Wow. Again, this goes back to one of the verses in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita where Master explains how Bhishma's conch shell is the breath that brings awareness back to the body, that attaches the ego to the physical vehicle through which we are expressing. I'm not going to get into the detail of that verse and that symbolism here. The only reason that comes to my mind right now is because that physical breath is how we affirm our connection with the body. So when that fear grips us, immediately we bring ourselves back into this body by using the aid of that physical breath. I'm going to skip a few verses. The senses of touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing vanish in succession. The sense of hearing is the last to leave the consciousness of the dying man. That is why it's extremely unwise even to whisper within the hearing of a dying person, everything is over, he's going to die, or anything unpleasant. This is again an important lesson. In fact, going back to what I was referring with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this whole book is being read to the dying person so he can hear, and they continue reading even after he has physically left the body, because the sense of hearing is the last sense to leave. So even though people around the dying person might imagine or believe that he has already left, he might still be hearing whatever is being said. And oftentimes for that same reason, it is recommended, Master taught us to chant Om in the right ear of the person who is leaving their body. And that is one of the ways in which we can align them to the transition that is coming about, and they can lift themselves through that journey as they pass through the tunnel of light. Now I'll again skip there's a lot that Master writes about the dying process, all of which is extremely fascinating and worth reading. The ordinary man, after he experiences the sense of suffocation, finds himself suddenly relieved of the weight of his body, of the necessity of breathing, and of any physical pain. After that, he enters into a state of oblivious sleep 1,000,000 times deeper and more enjoyable than the state of ordinary deep sleep. A sense of soaring through a very peaceful tunnel of gloom is experienced by the soul. And again, here Master qualifies by saying ordinary man. And this is the point of this video. I'm going to come to it in a little bit, although the introduction has taken quite some time already. He's talking about and distinguishing the death that is experienced by somebody who has not already tasted the bliss of meditation, the peace of deep meditation through a practice such as Kriya Yoga, contrasting it with somebody who he calls ordinary, essentially somebody who has simply engaged with the world on a material plane, who has not experienced those deeper states of awareness and consciousness that come through the practice of meditation. And as he's pointing out here, after that prana is leaving these chakras, all these lower chakras, we enter, or I should say not we, but the ordinary man enters a state of oblivious sleep. This word oblivious is important because this is something involuntary. The soul is being pushed into this state. The prana is being withdrawn from the body, and although it is involuntary, it is enjoyable. As Master says, it's 1,000,000 times deeper than the deepest sleep that you can experience in the body. That is quite fascinating to think about, and even to contemplate on how enjoyable deep sleep is for all of us. Doesn't matter who you are, but deep sleep is an extremely enjoyable state because of how rejuvenating it is for our bodies and for our minds. And now he's talking about a kind of sleep that is 1,000,000 times more enjoyable and deeper than the deep sleep that we experience through this body. Sometimes when a man dies quickly, for instance, by hanging or electrocution or by a short or sudden accident, he experiences practically no physical pain. All of that suffering is mental, which is to say, when the death is sudden, the person has already left the body. Many people talk about going through near-death experiences when there is a violent crash or an accident, and they even describe how they were observing the accident as it was happening, which is to say, they were seeing their own physical body die in front of their eyes because their soul already left, because their soul knew what was coming and they had escaped that physical pain, but they were only mentally suffering and observing that instance in front of their own eyes as it was happening. Now, what happens from then on? The body, as we are dissociating from, is left behind, and the soul now has entered the sleep. And the soul wakes up, as Yogananda ji describes, in the astral world. So, every time there is a death in the physical plane, there is a birth in the astral plane. Here, the family is mourning the physical death, and there your astral family is celebrating the astral birth. It is very fascinating even to think about and contemplate how these two worlds are just complementary, and how this astral self is in fact more real, more of who we are than this physical body, which is even more temporary than the astral body. I mean, ultimately, even the astral body is temporary, because as we move towards God realization, we transcend all these limitations. And Master again goes on to give very, very detailed and vivid descriptions of the astral world also. I'll just share some of this. The images that Yogananda uses are so beautiful and bright. It's sometimes interesting even to read them, his language and the flair with which he writes. He says, in the astral rainy season, the rays pour down over the golden soil, emanating an ineffable variety of music of the spheres. They form flower shapes as they fall, so that during the astral rain one can perceive a sheet of silver threads dangling daisies and roses of light and showering them on the astral land. Flower-shaped pools of light bedeck the streets during an astral rain. Now, I don't know what to make of it. Even more than focusing on the exact images that he's presenting, I don't know how pools can be flower shaped. It's not something I can clearly visually imagine, but all that I feel through the writings of Master and how he describes the astral world is just the ineffable beauty of the sphere, of how the astral realm is made of pure feeling. It is not limited by material constraints. It is not abstracted through the perception of the senses. So when we experience things in the astral world, it is just, as Master says, for lack of a better word, million times more enjoyable, million times more deeper, million times more vivid. And that's why he's giving these images of what happens in the astral world. In essence, he's not actually describing physical details. It is not silver or gold or actual flowers, because we cannot actually perceive or experience them through the senses. But he's talking about the feeling of what the image of shiny gold evokes in your heart, the feeling of daisies and lotuses and roses blooming and falling down, silver threads from the skies, and all of this, that image of beauty, that's what he's evoking in our own hearts by giving these descriptions of the astral world. But the astral world is not all beauty itself, because there are all kinds of realms in the astral world. So which part of astral world we go to and what we experience there also heavily depends on what our own human life was like when we lived it on this plane. What I mean to say is, if we have not led a noble life, a pious life, a sincere, honest life, if we have been mean, if we have been unkind, if we have experienced a lot of, or rather expressed a lot of negative qualities during our own lifetime, then the astral experience is not going to be pleasant. It's going to be quite unpleasant. In fact, even the unpleasantness of it is going to be a million times darker than what or how we would suffer on the physical plane. That is also implied in a lot of what Master is writing about. That's where the idea of heaven and hell comes from. Especially in the Christian tradition, we talk about heaven and hell as states that we go to in the afterlife. Of course, the Sanatana Dharma goes further. Heaven is just a state, it's just the astral world. It's not the same as God realization, but it is a real state. What it is the astral world, because astral world is as beautiful as heaven. That's what we go, that's where we go to after we leave this body. And what is hell? Hell is also that suffering that we experience if we have not led a good life on this planet, if we have not loved, if we have not been kind, if we have not been generous, if we have been rude and unkind and mean and dishonest in our life. All those feelings that we have kept inside ourselves, all that negativity is multiplied a million times. Why is it so? Because these feelings are no longer constrained by the physical body. When we are in the body, even if we are extremely negative or extremely cruel, We can only express it to a certain extent. And even if we are extremely elevated, even that is limited, because after a certain time, we are just compelled by the impulses of the body, the impulse to sleep, the impulse to eat, all the physical compulsions that come along. So they distract us from deeply experiencing the essence of all those feelings that are inside of us. Whereas in the astral world, where we are no longer contained by that physical body, by that physical container, the feelings multiply a million times, and that's why the experience of it is a lot more vivid and deeper and brighter. Whether it's positive or negative, we have to go through that experience. And as he says here, Master also describes how saints and the great souls, the pious and devoted ones, how they occupy the higher vibrations of the astral world, and those who are wicked and mean and greedy, they inhabit the lower neither regions of the astral world, and there's a lot of regions of vibration in between the two as well. And he interestingly talks about how the astral mansions where the saints live, it's devoid of magnetic disturbances. They are more free to experience the astral world more fully, and they can travel or see any region in the astral world. Whereas those who live, as Master puts it, in the astral slums, in the neither regions of the astral world, they cannot freely go to the higher worlds. They live in a much coarser negative vibration. The saints can still come and reach them, and those souls that are in these lower regions can look up, but they cannot transcend or move to that plane unless they can hold on to a guide or a spirit that is helping them lift out of that lower plane in order to move to a higher plane. It is all just very interesting to contemplate on, because these are realities that all of us in fact know. It is all part of our deep memory. Of course, we are now living on this physical plane where all of this seems far off, or in fact rather theoretical, but these are realities that we will be experiencing one day or another. We have already experienced it in the past, and it is going to be part of our future as well. Now, where does the idea of meditation and Kriya Yoga come into this picture of death and conscious dying, and how we can gracefully exit this body, how we can prepare for that final exam? Even before discussing some of the metaphysics of it, I want to talk about the general principles of what we are trying to do in meditation and how it is related to death. Because all that we do in meditation, especially in a scientific technique such as Kriya Yoga, is that we are consciously detaching ourselves from the senses, from the extremities of the body. Now, as we were discussing Master's writings on this, that's what happens when the prana leaves the heart center and it's trying to exit the subtle spine. It's trying to exit that physical body that it has been inhabiting. And at that moment, we face that extreme mental grief because we are being forced out. That state is extremely unnatural to us. However, if we have been practicing meditation, we have been practicing it consciously. We have already had some training in detaching our senses from that physical body to reaffirm that our fundamental reality is not physical, that we are not bound by this vehicle that is carrying us right now in this moment. And the other part of it is what Master calls the oblivious sleep, that sleep that the ordinary man is forced into, which is essentially subconscious in nature. Somebody is pushed into that state because when the physical body dies, when the physical brain dies, they do not have a means of experiencing consciousness in any other way. Because the ordinary man, I use that word because Master uses it, but in essence I'm talking about somebody who has only lived in the world of senses. That person's experience of reality is completely limited to what he can experience through the five senses that are communicated to and processed in the brain. Now, when the senses are no longer there, and that brain, which is the physical medium for processing the sensory input, when that is also dying, the person has no prior context for experiencing or expressing consciousness. So they feel obligated to go into the state of deep sleep. As enjoyable as that sound, that state of deep sleep is subconscious. It is in fact unconscious, and that is the opposite of what we are trying to do in meditation, because as the prana is leaving the body, by default when we are being pulled out, it goes through all the spinal centers or the chakras and it leaves through the medulla. That is the point through which it entered that body. Now, as Kriya Yogis, as meditators, we are trying to lift this unconscious process into the conscious realm. We are trying to draw that prana up through conscious will and leave through this point, this spiritual eye here, which is that doorway into Christ consciousness. And when we are able to exit the body through that point in the astral spine, we are no longer obligated to go into those unconscious states of sleep, to wake up in the astral world and again be drawn to that physical plane and wake up as a baby coming through a mother's womb and then again go through that process of death, because all of this is unconscious, is involuntary. And when we learn to become masters of our energy and we are able to direct that energy consciously through the upper centers in the spine, this process becomes voluntary. Then we can exit the body, we can traverse the astral realms and come back to it, and it becomes a matter of choice. And that's where the biggest difference comes between somebody who has had a taste of deep and true meditation and somebody whose experience of the world is completely limited by the senses. Now I want to read for you an excerpt from Swami Kriyananda's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita as explained by Paramahansa Yogananda. Yogananda ji talks about this in many different places. This small excerpt from the essence of the Bhagavad Gita is a great summary of this process of death for a Kriya Yogi. So I thought it'll be worthwhile sharing in this particular context. Life begins its involvement with the objective world with the baby's first cry, or rather with the first quick breath that is required to make that first cry. Swami here is talking about that very first inhalation, the very first breath we take when we come out of the mother's womb, and that marks the beginning of that incarnation, even as astrologers plot it. Of course, life even in that vehicle starts well before that, at that moment of conception. Going back to some of that description of the astral realms that Yogananda ji gives, in that same talk, he talks about how when the sperm and the ovum unite, at that moment there is a flash in the astral world, and immediately souls that are in tune with that vibration are drawn to that spark, and they enter that one cell, that fused cell of the sperm and the ovum. And that cell, interestingly, is this point, the medulla. That's where life begins. That's the mouth of God, as the Indian scriptures explain it. And here Swami Kriyananda is talking about the beginning of life and engagement with the world, which starts with that first inhalation that we all take. At death, by contrast, there is what is known as the death rattle, or the final exhalation, which occurs as energy enters the Pingala Nadi. And here's where he gets into the metaphysics of death itself, because as we all know, if you remember from the previous episodes of the same series, during exhalation, energy enters the Pingala Nadi. And the ego's energy flows inward more deeply and back to the medulla. This is what I was describing a few minutes ago, which is when the process of death is involuntary, when the process of death is not conscious, then that ego is pulling that prana back to this point, to the medulla, where it is centered, because all that prana energy is drawn from the physical body, drawn away from the senses into the spine, and it's flowing upward, but it's not flowing upward towards this point, but rather towards this point, into medulla, where the ego is resting. Thus, it prepares for its departure from the body, exiting through the same doorway by which it entered the body when the sperm and ovum united to create that body. This is what, again, I was saying. When the sperm and ovum united, life entered through this point, that first cell, which is the medulla, that point that connects the spinal cord to the brain. And when life is leaving that body, it again exits through that same point by default. The spiritually advanced yogi, finally, we are talking about somebody who's not the ordinary man. The spiritually advanced yogi's energy enters the deep spine on exhalation and flows through the sushumna to the spiritual eye in the forehead. Again, we have discussed some of these ideas of the nadis, Pingala, Ida, and Sushumna, and the deep spine, and how energy can be raised through the Sushumna through the practice of Kriya Yoga. The kutastha, where the spiritual eye appears, is the positive pole of which medulla oblongata is the negative. So here is the positive pole of the sixth chakra, and this is the negative. And the spiritually advanced yogi, when they are able to draw that energy into deep sushumna during that final exhalation, is able to bring that energy up to this positive pole of kutastha, or the spiritual eye. Yogis and saints and other religions who are able to exit the body through the spiritual eye need not pass through what the ancient Greeks, as we said earlier, called the waters of Lethe. In other words, yogis do not sink back temporarily as ordinary human egos do into subconscious rest, but soar into superconsciousness. That is the promise. Now, this process of drawing that energy into that deep spine and exiting through the spiritual eye cannot just happen in the final moment unless we have practiced. We have practiced through our daily life by living more and more from that deep spine and by drawing our energy up through that spine through a practice such as Kriya Yoga. In the Christian scriptures, there is this very cryptic line by Saint Paul where he says, I die daily. Now, it is interpreted in many different ways. As Yogananda ji gave its true interpretation, what Saint Paul was describing is this conscious method of drawing that energy into the deep sushumna and drawing it upward toward that spiritual eye and piercing that five-pointed star of Christ. That is the process of death, not the kind of death where we are pushed into subconscious sleep, where we are involuntarily drawn out of the body, but the kind of death where we are able to consciously lift ourselves into a higher realm, lift ourselves to transcend the limitations of the physical plane and to embrace the divine consciousness more and more fully. Now, there's so much more that could be said on this topic, but I am running out of time for today. I'll meet you next week with another interesting topic, and if you have any questions on this particular topic or anything else I've covered so far, feel free to write to me or leave below in the comments. I hope to see you soon again with another interesting topic on Kriya Yoga and this path of meditation. Until then, God bless you all.